You're listening to Almost Cooperstown, the place where near Baseball Hall of Famers live, wait, hope, and die. Since 1876, more than 19,000 players have set foot on Major League Baseball fields. There are 235 actual players that have been elected to the Hall of Fame, and we think there's room for a few more.
Welcome to episode 2 of Almost Cooperstown, Furthest From Almost. I'm Mark.
And I'm Gordon, and this week we're going to be discussing the guys that put together a career that puts them the furthest away from Cooperstown. We've been looking at the guys last week that were the closest and really deserved to be in there. This week we wanted to take a look at some of the guys that they were just bad.
Well, and they were bad over a long period of time. 10-year careers, right? So to play 10 years in the major leagues means somebody gave you a contract, they asked you to come play for them. These guys, we found, are really, really bad. They have historical bad statistics.
Yeah, and one of the things we were really looking at for this is career war. We wanted to look for guys that somehow over 10 years, it means managers kept putting you out on the field, and over your career, you still cost your teams wins. That's not an easy thing to do.
Right, having a negative WAR for your career means your team would have been better off had you not played. So to do that for your entire career and get a job every year just amazes us. So let's go around and talk about some of the players that we have on there. You go first.
So I actually have a first baseman, which it's actually harder to find than you would think, just because if you can't hit as a first baseman, they're getting you out of there. You're not going to find too many guys that were first basemen just because of their glove. You have to at least be able to hit a little bit. But there was a guy who did play, started in 74, played till 85, first baseman for the Detroit Tigers, the Oakland Athletics, and the Mariners, Dan Meyer, who over a 11-year career put together the blistering WAR of negative 6.4.
Wow.
Yeah, that's just bad.
Wow.
I mean, and you look at the career stats and you immediately start seeing, right, he was a career 253 hitter.
As a corner. Okay, so he hit a lot of home runs.
No, he had 86.
Okay, he drove in a lot of runs?
459.
I'm sure he didn't steal a lot of bases, and I imagine the glove was a steel glove at first base if he's got that.
Well, with his career 61 steals, I don't think anybody would consider him blisteringly quick.
Wow.
Yeah. And it wasn't like he wasn't playing. He played over his 162 game, like he averaged 162 games. Like he played a good amount in these seasons.
Yeah, I noticed his career on-base percentage was 290, or even less than that. What was it?
It was 293.
293.
Yeah, that's just rough. Yeah. Like, if you're not even getting on base 3 out of 10 times, you're really hurting your team. Now, the only interesting thing about Dan Meyer, if you would have you know, is that there's another Dan Meyer who also had a career negative WAR.
No way.
Yes. Pitcher for the Florida Marlins, Dan Meyer, who over a only 5-year career still managed to put up a negative P-WAR of 0.9.
So I guess if your name's Dan Meyer, you probably shouldn't go into baseball, it would appear.
I mean, you should, because you're good enough to be a professional. You just won't be very good.
Well, I'll throw a guy at second base or shortstop, but maybe we should skip the middle infielders, and because there are so many middle infielders, right? So I was gonna throw a second baseman. There's a lot of shortstops. We'll just move over to third base, the other corner position, because like you said, it's hard to be a guy at a negative WAR playing a corner position. You're supposed to bring a bat and RBIs and whatnot. And at third, you're supposed to bring a glove. And I remember a guy who played in the 1970s. He managed to play for the Cardinals at a time when they weren't any good. In fact, the year that he came up, they were particularly bad, and they went to the World Series 2 years after he left the team. But he did play 11 years. His name is Ken Reitz. And I remember Ken Reitz playing in the major leagues for a long time, and he was just a third baseman on the Cardinals. But you look at his career, it doesn't look that bad with having a 260 career batting average. And then you start looking at the numbers that define corners, okay? He had home runs, but 68 over 11 years.
I mean, that's less than 7 a season.
Yeah, that's really rough.
It's barely more than 6 a season.
Maybe he had a high on-base percentage. No, it was 290 for his career.
Oof.
Slugging at 359 for a corner. He did win a Gold Glove in 1975.
But he only won 1. That's kind of weird.
Yeah. Well, that's at a time when I think there was a third baseman in Philadelphia who was cleaning up with the Gold Gloves in Mr. Schmidt. So and it was really hard to find corners, by the way, right? There aren't that many that have negative career WAR.
And that's what we're talking about here when we're saying that these guys are some of the worst of all time. Obviously, if we compared them to a regular person, they would make us look like chumps. But, I mean, in comparison to his peers that played in the major leagues, I mean, the advanced stats don't lie. Ken Wright struggled.
Ken Reitz was not a good ball player. So let's move around and come up with some of the outfielders here, and we'll go back to the middle infielders at the end. So what do you got for outfield?
So I had to kind of go back for this one. He's not somebody that I had heard of previous to kind of going out and find him, but, he was born a few years before me, and he started playing well before I was alive. Started playing in 1934, Tuck Steinbach.
Oh.
And I'm sure you have never heard of him.
I have never heard of Tuck Steinbach. Makes me think of the Oakland A's guy, Terry Steinbach, but I guess that wouldn't put him in.
Unlike Mr. Steinbach, he actually had a positive WAR. Tuck Steinbach's career WAR is negative 6.2.
Oh my goodness.
Which is rough. Now, he was an outfielder, so you expect him to have a little pop, a decent average. Career 260 hitter.
Oof.
And you're like, oh, well, maybe he hit some home runs. He wasn't playing in the dead ball era. This was the 1930s. 17 career home runs.
How many years did he play?
13.
13 years.
He had seasons where he didn't hit a home run. Just think about that. Think about that. Didn't hit a home run for a season. Maybe got on base all the time. 259 career average with an on base of 284. I mean, just...
Yeah, and how do you get guys? I guess today would be really hard to last that long because they would just find a cheaper player to come in those days. Maybe
you just wouldn't. You wouldn't be able to survive having a season where you played some of the numbers that he played and put up the numbers that he did. That's just rough.
I found a guy. Also, I didn't see play, and I had to go back to the stat pool to come up with a guy who had a career negative WAR of 2.8, and that's Bob Kennedy. He's not one of the Kennedy families or the political family. This was a baseball player who played 16 years in the major leagues and accumulated a whopping total of 62 home runs over his entire major league career. So that's pretty bad. 254 career average.
That makes it worse.
Okay, that makes it worse. He had 514 RBIs, and he finished his career in 1957. So he played from 39 to 57. That's a long time. And he missed the years during the war, so he didn't play in 43, 44.
So, 45. He got a little robbed of what people would probably consider some of the prime years of his career, but, I mean, still.
I love looking at a guy's stats when I see his entire career, and he never led the league in anything. So, he didn't, not even in, grounding into double plays or something silly like that.
There's nothing. He was entirely unremarkable in a sense.
How did he get 16 years in the major?
Maybe that's how. The managers just forgot he was on the team.
Now, there's another outfielder, and I think you might have seen him play, and his son is in the major leagues now. So.
I mean, that makes it easy. Obviously, we're talking about Dante Bichette.
Did you see Bichette play?
I did see Bichette play, yeah, of course. He had a couple unbelievable years.
So how does he get on this list? Well, he has a career WAR of 5.7. That's pretty low for an outfielder.
I mean, it's not that low, but when you start looking at his statistics, it starts being unbelievable that's it as low as it is. I mean, this guy was almost a career 300 hitter. He had a career 299 with 274 home runs. So this was a guy that, put together, when you look at some of the seasons, look at his 95 season for the Colorado Rockies. He hit 340 with 40 home runs and 128 RBIs. Led the league in slugging and total bases that year.
He finished second in the MVP voting that year.
He's a 4-time All-Star, and he still only managed 5.7 career WAR.
Well, one of the reasons might be, and you look at the 299 average, that's one thing. The on-base percentage at 336. I mean, did you just never walk?
I wonder how many of those walks would have just been straight-up intentional walks. Too.
And particularly in Colorado.
Exactly.
That's a great point. But he only had a slugging percentage of 499, so I don't know how you can have 274 home runs and a slugging percentage of 499 playing in Colorado. So, there's a Colorado bias there, but the guy had what might look to, in the old days, pretty good stats with 1,141 RBIs, but he obviously was a terrible fielder.
His career fielding percentage was 974.
Yeah.
That's rough. He was just a butcher in the field. He had 80 errors in his career as an outfielder.
And he played 14 years in the major leagues.
You're looking at 4 or 5 errors a season, minimum. That's brutal.
But I never thought of him as bad a ball player as the career WAR would suggest.
But I think it's important when you're saying that WAR does take into account how good, you have to be an absolute butcher in the field for it to really hurt you. But if you are, I mean, a guy like Dante Bichette, despite all that he brought offensively, really wasn't that much better than the average player because he was so bad defensively.
And that's, and just gives you a barometer when you look at the WAR statistics, a barometer as to how did he perform against his peers. And we really, like to look at that because I would have not included him in that until you start looking at the more advanced stats. So what do you want to do? Do you want to go back to the middle infield?
Let's get back to the middle infield. Yeah.
So a second baseman, and I found many shortstops. I found 9 shortstops.
We could have made it a team of shortstops, basically.
And just a couple of second basemen, and I put this guy above. I had 2 guys at second base, but this guy had a career negative WAR of 5.2. I hadn't really heard of him. Ed Romero. He played.
I certainly haven't heard of him.
When I was watching baseball, came up in 77. Didn't play in 78 and 79 in the major leagues. I don't know why. And managed a 12-year major league career, hitting .247, which for a middle infielder is not that horrible, with a whopping 8 home runs in 12 years.
It's pretty rough.
8 home runs in 12 years. I mean, what were you doing out there? He had 9 stolen bases for his career.
So he wasn't hitting home runs. He wasn't stealing bases. Doesn't sound like he was doing much.
Well, his on-base percentage for a middle infielder, you'd expect to be good. At .298, it wasn't. He slugged at .302. I mean, that's just... The question is, and he didn't play a lot of games. He never had a season where he played more than 116 games. But he did play 12 years in the major leagues. So that's, pretty amazing that a guy who had no distinguishing stat. Now, I'll throw another guy at you that... was as a Met fan, was a guy I watched play a lot, and I didn't think he was that bad, but the stats, suggest otherwise, with a career WAR of negative 6.9. That's Doug Flynn.
Gold Glove winner?
I don't think so. You're right, he did. He won a Gold Glove in 1980. That's very good. So, yeah, he finished his career in 85, came up in 75, and again logs 11 years in the major leagues with a snappy .238 career average.
That's brutal. That's the lowest we've seen so far.
And how about, look at the on-base, 266. I don't think I've ever seen anybody with a career on base, for that many years at 266.
I mean, that's hard. I mean, you're barely getting on base. And 1 out of every 4 times. Ugh.
And he played a lot of games in the middle point of his career. In the mid-70s, he played 156 games. That probably was more an indication of how terribly bad the Mets were at that time that he got to play that much.
But if you're thinking about it, it's almost more interesting to compare. You could argue that Doug Flynn was probably more detrimental to his team than Ed Romero. You have to wonder, who was more detrimental to your team? Doug Flynn put together less negative career WAR over more games, but he played a lot more. Romero somehow managed in way less games to be even worse. Who was more actively detrimental to your team? I don't know. They both kind of suck.
I imagine the management would say we could have lost without you, as it wouldn't really matter. So if we fly over to shortstop, there's a lot of guys, and that kind of makes sense historically when you think about statistics like WAR, because such a defensive-minded position, that would be the place where you probably would find the most guys that just managed to keep a job because they managed to be able to field a baseball. So a bunch of guys, we can kind of go down a list, but the top guy, and I watched him play, and I guess that's why I put him in there, was Tom Verizor, another Cardinal. I sure hope he didn't play with Ken Reitz. That would be a horrible idea.
I'm guessing those teams that if they were both on them, they were not very good.
Let's see. Verizor actually came up in 73 and 84. He was, in fact, a teammate of Ken Reitz.
So those mid-70 Cardinals...
No, I'm sorry, I'm wrong. Verizor played for the Tigers.
Okay.
So I guess I thought he was a Cardinal. I'm wrong. So, but he played 1,000 games in the major leagues.
That's not an insignificant number of them.
Hit 241 with a 283.
That isn't an insignificant number.
No awards, so he had no gold gloves or whatnot. But he did play a lot of games for a lot, 128, 97, 125, 130.
I mean, when you're playing those many games, to me, that means you're the regular starter. I think that's an important distinction, that this guy, despite being as clearly not good as he was, still managed to con a team essentially into making him their everyday starter.
Well, and that just tells you, I'm sure if I go back and look at, he played for the Tigers until 77 and then moved to the Indians. I don't remember either the Tigers at that point or or the Indians being any good, and that kind of makes sense.
Which makes sense. You've got your traditionally lightest, the most acceptable position on the field, really, for a batter to not be performing up to what people would consider major league standards just because of the old way of perceiving shortstops. That really wasn't changed up until you got to the 90s and you started having the guys at shortstop emerge as, power hitters. Yeah. So I could imagine history, which is why we found 9 of them. History just littered with shortstops that really couldn't hit, and they probably weren't as good as fielders as people thought they were. They were just kind of crappy baseball players.
Well, let me give you the names and see if can you name any of these guys that you have heard of. Gary Sutherland had a negative 3.8 career WAR. Yeah, I didn't really know him either. Dal Maxwell. I watched play for the Cardinals back in the 60s.
If you watched him play in the 60s, I definitely haven't heard of him.
I'm just saying that I remember his name. Johnny LeMaster, I remember, was a giant. Hal Lanier was a manager later in his in life, was also a giant. I didn't think he was that lousy at 10-year career, .9. Ricky Gutierrez.
I mean, the name sounds familiar, but I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah. There was a Brave named Andres Thomas, who played 5 years with a negative 5.7 career WAR in 5 years.
I feel like that's almost remarkable because he's one of the rare cases where it was just so abundantly clear how bad he was. We're like, no, we can't let him stay in the major leagues for that long.
And a name, Chris Gomez played 16 years with a negative 1.4. And a guy that always is the top of the list that I see other people write about bad baseball players, a guy named Juan Castro. He played 17 years and had a 5.4 WAR. So that's just 17 years. Just impresses me to be that bad for that long.
Like to be like such a your average WAR per season is just so bad. You're barely helping your team win a game per year at that point.
So could you find any catchers? Because it's you would think you would find catchers with low WAR on one side because they didn't have to hit necessarily as long as they were good receivers.
But positionally, the thing you have to remember is kind of like shortstops is you have to be so much worse than the average catcher in order to accumulate a negative career WAR because their position's already not expected to be hitting. So there is a guy he's actually a current player, which is a bit unusual that there's somebody active going on right now. And I know he does have the reputation for being a fantastic pitch framer, which is something that WAR cannot encapsulate. It can't capture that. And if anything, that's going towards the pitcher. But he currently played last year for the Texas Rangers, Jeff Mathis.
Oh, yeah. He's been a career backup, right?
He's a career backup. He's never been the lead guy on his team in terms of getting the starts, but over a 9-year career, he has managed to put together, a 15-year career starting in 2005. He's managed to put together the blistering WAR of negative 1.5. And I mean, the dude's a career 158 hitter.
No way. There's no way. Wait.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. 2019, he was a 158 hitter.
Right.
He was a career 195 hitter.
He still doesn't hit that
So he's still below the Mendoza line.
They should not call it the Mendoza line. They should call it the Mathis line.
I feel like Mendoza's a bit more of an extreme example, but still, I mean, the guy's hit 195 for his career. That's just... I mean, he played 86 games last year.
He played 86 games and hit 158.
He had 228 at-bats and hit 158. I don't even know how you do that. He had 36 hits.
And I'm sure he's a really nice guy.
Oh, yeah. And the thing is, I know defensively, he's a good catcher. That's why he gets put in. I want to say it was for the Angels, but I remember even hearing it talked about that he was being played over some of the other catchers because the pitchers like pitching to him, because he's good at pitch framing.
And he pitched, he caught for the Diamondbacks in 17 and 18, and you think about catching Greinke and some of these guys, and that they like throwing to a catcher like that. And that's one of the other reasons why.
And so, the stats don't always tell the full story of the player, especially when you're looking at a guy, especially when you're looking at very specific positions, like a catcher.
Right. So pitcher, there are a lot of pitchers. Pitcher WAR is different, and we've kind of talked about that a little bit. We'll speak about it a little bit more. But there's a lot of guys, and so I threw a list out there. Why don't you, pick one on there and talk about them?
Yeah, and so I was actually able to find one. Thankfully, unlike some of the other guys on this list, he's not a Met. We're talking about somebody that they actually got to face a fair bit, and I'm pretty sure they probably beat him up quite a bit. It would be Randy Lurch.
He was a lefty, I think.
He was a lefty. He pitched from 75 to 84, mostly playing for the Phillies, but then also mixing in some seasons for the Expos, the Giants, the Brewers. And, I mean, not an awful career WAR compared to some of the other guys, but still a negative 2.1 career WAR. I mean, 60 and 64. I mean, this is where it gets about 4.53 ERA.
At a time where that ERA was very high, right? You were pitching to lower ERAs at that time.
I mean, this is really the damning thing for him. A 1.51 whip.
Yeah, they didn't calculate whip when he was pitching, so they
No.
didn't really use stuff like that.
No, but they probably should have, because he would have pitched a lot less than if he had.
He just knew he walked a lot of guys and didn't strike out a lot.
Yeah, that's rough.
Yeah, he was a pretty lousy pitcher, I remember, but didn't realize he was that bad. So another guy on there I'd like to talk about is a guy who pitched for the Yankees, and he didn't quite pitch 10 years. It was hard to find pitchers. So he pitched 9 years in the major leagues, and he's a guy named Mike Kekich. Yeah, you probably
Never heard of him.
Never heard of Mike Kekich. So Mike Kekich, was lousy, and his career stats sort of stand up with a negative 5.1 WAR. He pitched in the 70s, came up in 65, pitched until 1977, had a couple of years where he didn't pitch at all. The stats are not that crazy with a 4.59 ERA and 39-51. Just a pitcher who pitched a lot of games for a lot of, at that time, those were the bad Yankee teams.
So he sounds like a bad pitcher on a bad Yankee team, but other than that, he sounds pretty unremarkable.
Well, he's not unremarkable because he's famous for one thing that I remember very, very well, and he had a teammate, another pitcher on the team named Fritz Peterson.
Now, was Peterson better or worse than Kekich?
Peterson was better.
Okay, so Peterson was actually good.
He was actually a pretty decent pitcher. But what they did during, I think it was the 1973 season, is they traded wives and families during the season.
Wait, are you saying what I think you're saying?
Yeah. The kids were not traded for future consideration. Literally, Kekich ended up with Peterson's wife, and Peterson ended up with Kekich's wife and their families. And I think to this day, Peterson and Kekich's ex-wife are still married. Kekich got divorced.
But still, that is insane.
Yeah, and that was back page news. And again, at a time when the Yankees weren't very good. The Yankees were going to get good kind of after those guys left, and I never really connected.
So, like, they were like the original wife swap?
I don't know what happened, but those two guys, that situation was really something to remember. Another guy that I put on the list, because I remember what happened to him. I didn't realize he was this bad a pitcher. A guy named Jack Hamilton.
Never heard of him.
Okay, negative career WAR over 8 years, negative 4.4. What I remember about him is he was the guy on the mound in 1967 who hit Tony Conigliaro of the Red Sox with a pitch, and Conigliaro was the home run champion as a young player from the year before, and he got this nasty, huge black eye that Sports Illustrated put on the cover, and the only cover shot was this gruesome picture of this guy, and unfortunately for Conigliaro, he was never the same player after that.
Because he messed up his vision.
Correct.
Oh, wow.
And for me, Jack Hamilton, I didn't realize he was, because he's more famous for hitting Conigliaro than...
It sounds like he's more infamous than anything.
Exactly. No, that would be true. Anybody else on the list pique your interest?
I think there's one more guy you have to mention, especially as a Met fan. Didn't play the 10 seasons, but he had a stretch that is so legendarily bad, I feel it kind of has to go mentioned here. That would be Anthony Young.
Oh,
I feel like it's a little unfair mentioning it, but he lost 27 or 27 decisions in a row.
Yeah, I remember that. And you'd watch the game, listen to the game, every game going, maybe he'll win this one, and somehow something bad. And yet he wasn't that bad a pitcher.
No!
He had stuff.
When you look at his season, in 1993, he went 1-16 for the Mets. You're thinking, this guy must be terrible. He had a 3.77 ERA.
Yeah. He just wasn't that bad, and yet he just couldn't win, and it was, the team was bad, and that's what happens or whatnot. But to lose 20, even though wins don't mean that much, losing 27 in a row, yeah.
I don't know how that wouldn't get to you mentally. You would, I feel like that would just... I mean, I remember when I was pitching, losing 1 in a row was rough. Losing 27? That would be impossible. You'd go insane. You'd go absolutely insane.
And interesting, I threw a reliever on there.
You did?
Yeah, also a Met for part of his career, and I don't remember, but he had a negative WAR, and it was hard to find relievers that had negative career WAR.
I think just because you're not going to amass that enough playing time to really get that much of a negative WAR as a reliever. You have to be legendarily bad.
Fans remember Doug Sisk, at least people that were around when he pitched, and he was seemed like an okay pitcher, but the stats don't back that up at all. and he was pretty lousy, finishing his career, I think, in 1991. So he only played 9 years, because for some reason, 89 he didn't play, and he must have been hurt or something like that. but the stats wouldn't necessarily suggest a negative WAR. But he must have been very ineffective with 22 wins in his career, 3.27 ERA, 33 career saves over 9 years. Just nothing distinguished at all, other than he didn't really help his team. His career was 3.1.
So but still, like for a guy that played as long as he did to do as little as he did, that's pretty impressive.
And you always talk about, the whip for a pitcher, a reliever shouldn't be high. His whip for his career was 1.51.
That's to me, that's a nightmare. If you're going to have a 1.51 whip as a reliever, you're basically saying, on average, you're going to bring me in for a clean inning, I'm going to spot the other team 2 base runners.
Yeah, I think that was Doug Sisk on FM. So, yep, that's kind of what happened.
It's like Familia on steroids, basically. Give you the heart attack every time the guy steps out there.
So pulling some of these stats, over time, we're not going to talk about, these lists of guys, but some of these players that we talked about are on there. But you'll notice a couple of names. Doug Flynn was on the list of all-time bad guys, as were some of the guys that we talked about. You mentioned a couple of guys, did you mention Betancourt as a guy who was historically bad?
I didn't think he was until I actually looked at the number. This is weird because you don't think guys from this era would really last around, but there's Yuniesky Betancourt, who's managed a blistering negative 2.5 WAR over his career. And then there are guys that even played more than that. There were, I remember Ty Wigington. I remember Nefi Perez. I remember Tony Womack. I thought Tony Womack was a good player.
Me too.
But then you look at his career stats and he put up 2.3 WAR with 4,900 plate appearances. That's just...
Yeah, and Willie Montañez is on that list for guys, that have been around a while, and he had a great afro. I remember that, but I don't remember him being that bad a player, but these advanced stats sort of, point out that, yeah, he was pretty lousy.
And I think that's just at the end of the day, you're just going to see less and less guys that are going to float around like this. I think unlike the Hall of Fame, which you could argue you're going to see expand more as guys over time are just putting up more and more impressive seasons, it's less likely you're going to see guys that put together careers like this because they're just not going to last.
Well, that's it. And the thing is the longer you play in the major leagues now, if you play 10 years, they're going to have to pay you. Whereas you can replace him with a young player who won't be any worse by the advanced stats, and you're paying him much less than that. So I think it's going to be much more difficult for that.
I think you're going to not see these, unless you get those weird one-off cases, and then those are going to be the fun guys to talk about. These guys are going to look back 15 years from now and be like, how the hell did he play for 10 seasons?
So we talk about famous players, and as we close this episode, next time I thought we might talk about some of the more unusual plays and players that played Major League Baseball that aren't necessarily in the Hall of Fame, but they have Hall of Fame-like incidences or things about their career that make them really famous, but doesn't necessarily... You could have things be in the Hall of Fame that are occasions, but not necessarily players.
Oh, certainly. You think you have to look back from the only pitcher to throw back-to-back no-hitters.
That would be one of them.
To the dog that got in the box score.
Yeah, well, that's not a major league guy, though. So.
That's not he's a dog.
Yeah, there's some really great stories. So we'll tackle that in our next episode. Thanks again for listening, everybody, and we'll talk to you next time.